der hessischen Landesvertretung zu einem Crisis Talk zu dem Thema Gemeinsam gegen Krisen, die EU-Afrika-Partnerschaft und die neuen geopolitischen Herausforderungen. Dies ist eine Veranstaltung des Leibniz Forschungsnetzwerk Umweltkrisen, Krisen, Umwelten und des Forschungsverband Normative Ordnungen der Goethe-Universität Frankfurt und natürlich des Hessischen Ministeriums für Bundes- und Europaangelegenheiten. Deswegen geht das erste Wort auch erstmal an die Ministerien, an die Ministerin, Frau Puttrich. Auf geht's.
Mrs. Puttrich, off we go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our representation in Brussels. Together with our partners, the Leibniz Research Network and the Goethe University. Today we'll be talking about the EU's relationship to Africa. Africa is a large continent, a lot connects us. We have a closely intertwined relationship. We are in one neighborhood, but we also have a common history looking back at colonialism. Today, Africa is of utmost importance to us for a number of geopolitical reasons. For long, we didn't deal sufficiently with our partner Africa, and now it is high time. There is a EU-Africa strategy where relationship to Africa is to be redeveloped. In my opinion, it is really important to discuss and to meet Africa as an equal partner. There's a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities. And that is why this event serves to discuss these opportunities and chances. How can we get closer together? And what can we do in this new geopolitical situation we find ourselves in? There are lots of topics, and I very much look forward to an interesting event. And I'm very pleased to give the floor to Dr. Stefan Kroll from the Leibniz Institute. Thank you very much, Dr. Schulten, for this friendly introduction. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Leibniz Peace Research Institute. Our topic is Together Against Crises. That's the topic of today's crisis talk. It's also the joint vision of Africa and the EU, the joint vision as it was called in the final declaration. And that's also what we expect in crises research, that crises are not only threats, but they're also tipping points where partnerships can be forged. And the EU is a partnership that was founded in a number of crises. And Dr. Antonia Witt will be telling us more about this today. Then there's a perhaps more critical perspective of crises, and that is that crises very much focus on specific challenges and thereby often forget looking at other extremely important points. And the EU-Africa partnership, the minister just alluded to it, we didn't do sufficient in the past during the corona pandemic. We were very much focused on the pandemic management. The Ukraine war is a similar story this year, where a lot of other crises weren't focused on sufficiently: health, energy, food security. And these are all things that we want to tackle in partnership with Africa. So I very much look forward to finding out what the current perspectives are in order to ensure that we focus on all of the crises, including the war, but also a partnership with Africa. We now have a paper that are making the results of the summit more concrete, and we have positive notes here, but a partnership requires dialogue, requires a level playing field, requires impulses from all sides to ensure that a strategy can be developed together. And we also need a better understanding. Europe and Africa are two large continents with a lot of variety, cultural and linguistic variety, which is why the relationship is very complicated indeed. Africa is a state with a whole lot of number of countries, and when it comes to these matters of crises, we need to consider that. And crisis talks also means organizing a dialogue between businesses and research institute. I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity of doing this here in the representation of Hess, and I'd like to thank all of the partners for allowing for this to happen. And I'd also like to thank the panelists which will now be introduced. I very much look forward to a common discussion. Thank you. Indeed, it's about dialogue. If you want to get involved from home, you can do so by writing an email to streamline@lv-brussels-hessen.de or by sending us a text message. You should have received the number already. It is also going to be shown now, so do ask your questions by sending us a text message or an email. Before we start with our discussion, we now look forward to the keynote speech by Dr. Antonia Witt. Dr. Antonia Witt is a researcher at the Leibniz Institute. Dr. Antonia Witt, you have the floor. Partnerships and crises. These are the key words for the next hour. A partnership in times of crises could mean two different things. It could be a partnership that stands strong in a crisis, that leads to overcoming a crisis together. But a partnership in a crisis could also be a partnership which itself is in a crisis, which leads to more conflict than solutions. If we speak about the relationship between Europe and Africa, or if we speak about the relationship between the EU and African states, then we would like to speak about the former, the image of a partner at a level playing field, which stands strong in difficult crises. This is the narrative that the European side wants to use as a description. It is often declared as a political goal, but indeed, a lot points to the relationship itself being in a crisis, because the many challenges of the last years meant that the political differences between Africa and the EU have risen. Allow me to mention a few examples. We had the pandemic, which of course knew no borders. Nevertheless, it led to bigger differences between African states and the European Union. Firstly, when it came to the EU's strict stance on freeing corona patents, but also when it comes to providing funds in the light of the pandemic. The Senegalese president spoke of a trauma for Africa. Only 8 African states have made progress in the area of human development since the beginning of the pandemic. For 40 African states, the Human Development Index is, compared to the times before the pandemic, has gone down. So for many African states, the pandemic was less of a health crisis, but also a social and economic crisis, which continues to endure. Another example, the security crisis in the Sahel region. From an African and European perspective, it is a real threat. But European engagement over the last years, especially when it comes to training and educating military and police forces in the Sahel states, not only led to the region being secure today. On the opposite, 2022 for Mali and Burkina Faso is already the most deadly year since the beginning of the crisis in 2012. And the European engagement is now faced with a growing anti-French and anti-Western atmosphere in society as well as amongst the ruling elite. This atmosphere has the potential of being decisive for the political development of the region and will, of course, have an effect on future cooperation between the EU and those states. The climate crisis is another example. 2% of the worldwide CO2 emissions come from Africa, but nevertheless, many African states are already most threatened by the consequences of climate change. Whether the Loss and Damage Fund will be implemented remains to be seen. At the same time, we can see that gas is being promoted, or gas development is being promoted in Africa, which of course contradicts the aims of the green transition. This political shift leads to economic options for Africa, but it also has a negative effect on the EU's reputation as being a driver of sustainability. And then we also have the crisis in Ukraine. On the one hand, it meant that the EU was displeased by the neutrality expressed by a lot of the African states. At the same time, on the other side, on the African side, the crisis led to other fears. It led to fears of a new bloc confrontation, and of course there are consequences when it comes to food and development security. At the same time, it led to criticism vis-à-vis European double standards when it comes to lacking solidarity in other areas. Now, all these crises and challenges have one thing in common. They show that not every crisis has a similar effect everywhere. Crises often show who experiences what when, who is situated in what fashion, and who has what means to mitigate the effects of crises. This often starts with the question of whether a situation is being perceived as a crisis or not. And if yes, as what type of crisis is it being perceived? The new geopolitical challenges are a good example for that because they show a certain degree of European, or they show us a European perspective. Oliver Smith, therefore, speaks of une crise révélatrice because crises elucidate the basic tenets of a society and economy because they reduce everything to the most essential. They visibly show who is located where around the world. And the youngest crises or challenges also show that when it comes to the structure of the relationship between Africa and the EU, not a whole lot has changed hitherto. They're still marked by the one side, the European, determines the priorities and the financial means, and then we have the other side, the African side, which is to implement these. But that way, crises are difficult to tackle together. The European Union reacted to this and triggered a number of new initiatives and approaches, including the comprehensive strategy with Africa, which is to promote cooperation in a number of areas beyond trade and development. The Global Gateway Initiative, for example, which we'll talk about, which aims to foresee 150 billion for the expansion of infrastructure. But we also have the Team Europe approach, which allows for flexible alliances between like-minded actors. Today, many observers aren't yet entirely sure about these initiatives because it will, of course, depend on the implementation. Promises have been made in the past. Now, all sides have to show that they will adhere to their word. Allow me to add something to these to my speech. It will especially depend on reducing the historic inequalities of the relationship. In order to be able to tackle crises together in the future, we need a political partnership where one side takes the other seriously and is also willing to give things away. This requires common interests, but it also requires the open recognition of criticism and divergences. A partnership mustn't always be unanimous, but both sides need a voice. When it comes to health policy, we can see this at the moment. At first, we had pretty big divergences, but we now have the new cooperation program, which aims to increase productivity and independence. But at the same time, it also serves European interests. So what would be required for strengthening the political partnership between Europe and Africa? 4 brief thoughts about this. Firstly, the African Union should have more room for maneuvering in the relationship, and African priorities should obtain more weight when it comes to setting the agenda. On the African side, this requires more unanimity and a bigger voice of the African Union to speak on behalf of African states. Then we also need strong support of the European Union for the African Free Trade Zone because it is an important key to reduce economic dependence. Thirdly, more focus should be paid to common learning. Because, of course, we have similar challenges in this area. For example, how to deal with authoritarian tendencies in member states. How can the youth and civil society be strengthened? These are challenges that both organizations are faced with. We could have more dialogue at a level playing field here, and this could also be communicated publicly. Fourthly, we need more cooperation for maintaining the multilateral order, which needs to be more inclusive and fairer to ensure that African states obtain more participation. For example, a seat of the AU in the G20, or I'm also thinking about reforming the Security Council. A political partnership that makes African interests more visible, and tackling these together is the best approach towards the fear that Africa could become an area where geopolitical interests are fought over. I would like to thank you wholeheartedly for your attention, and I very much look forward to our panel discussion. And Dr. Witt, do stay here, and I'd now kindly ask the other panelists to come on stage.
Vielen Dank. So, während wir noch
Whilst we wait for all panelists to sit down, I'll just briefly remember you that you can ask your questions at any time. Do send your email to streamline@lv-brussels.hessen.de or send us a text message to the number shown on your screen. Thank you very much. Now, to my left, I'd like to welcome Mr. Gahler. He's a member of the CDU and is a member of the European Parliament. You are the co-chair of the AKUPU, I think.
Ms. Philomena Apiko on the panel. You're head of the European Center for Development Policy Management, EU Relations team, and made the way from the Netherlands today here to join us, I think. Thank you very much. Außerdem darf ich noch einmal...
I'd also like to once again welcome Dr. Witt. You work in the Leibniz Peace Research Institute Frankfurt and are head of the African Intervention Politics Working Group. And the EU Commission is also represented today, Luisa Ossmann. You're the International Cooperation Officer in the DG International Partnerships. Very well. Then let's start. Dr. Witt already said a few very interesting points. Mr. Gahler, the EU-Africa relationship is in a crisis. Would you agree with this statement, or what are the biggest challenges in your opinion? Unfortunately, the sound isn't loud enough for the interpreter. We need more sound to be able to interpret this properly. We will do our best, but it's very low. So you said it yourself. We need to give the African Union more priority in our relationship. This begs the question of whether, as the European Union, we can afford continuing this way. We have the AKP framework. Where the Caribbean and Pacific islands are still part of this, or whether, together with the Africans, we want to go down a new approach where we bring together these two routes, these two approaches of the European Union. I wouldn't call it a crisis with regards to the African free trade area. It is an opportunity because, of course, we have made a lot of experiences with our free trade agreement, and now we have our customs and internal market. Now we've had a lot of experiences here, and we have had positive experiences, and if we can help our African partners implement this big agenda item, then I think this is a huge opportunity. Aside from that, of course, we have crises. We have instability in Sahel. We also have tensions in Ethiopia at the moment, unfortunately. And here, we're offering being helpful, but of course it also has to be accepted. You spoke about the post-Cotonou agreement. I would imagine that everyone knows what this is about, but perhaps you could nevertheless speak about the current state of affairs. In April 21, this was concluded, but it hasn't been ratified since. Is that correct? Correct. It isn't being ratified because we need to implement this unanimously, and the Hungarian government is blocking this for a while now. It is currently pretty much blocking all political areas where we need unanimity, for the obvious reason, in my opinion, that wherever the European Union wants to do something with regards to developing the rule of law, because of course we have the conditionality mechanism, which requires that rule of law is adhered to in all areas. So this is something we're working to, but the Commission last week said it isn't enough. And purely politically speaking, my impression is that one is blocking this also to see who has a longer breath at the end of the day. In this case, also at the cost of cooperation with the African partners. And of course, there's also dangers with regards to funding for Ukraine. Thank you very much for these informations. It leads us away, perhaps, from some of our partnerships. Ms. Ossmann, you were at the COP, I heard. And with regards to the climate crisis that Dr. Witt mentioned, we created this loss and damages fund. What was your impression there? Did you have the feeling that justice was created as a result? What was your impression? Thank you very much. Perhaps I could get back to what is even more topical at the moment. Last week, a lot happened in the EU-Africa partnership. There was also the meeting of the two commissions of the African Union and the European Union. And I thought it was very interesting what Mrs. Witt said in her keynote speech, that it is important that the two commissions and that the two continents meet at a level playing field. And that is also what the European Commission is doing together with the African Union. Last week, on Monday, there was this meeting between the two commissions. 5 African commissioners and 22 European ones met. And that also clearly shows that both sides are still engaged in this partnership, and that especially in times of crises, it is very important to work together and to ponder over the common priorities together and how these can be implemented. On the EU side, we have the Global Gateway Investment Package, Africa-Europe, which is there to support the goals up to 2030, but also serves to support the African Agenda 2063. So it is a mutual beneficial strategy. And in February of this year, a common vision for 2030 was identified. And now, of course, it's all about how this can be implemented. And it's about identifying the topics that both sides consider very important. And of course, we share most crises, be it climate change, be it the consequences of the war, or be it the corona pandemic. And the Global Gateway is a very important tool for this inclusive, green expansion, and is also there to attack the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic. And I also found it very interesting what was said about impulses from all sides. Last week on Monday, during the meeting of the two commissions, civil society organizations and youth organizations also were there, and they met commissioners in the morning to ensure that we have this direct link with the local realities on the ground, and to ensure that the discussions don't only take place at an institutional level. Now, with regards to the COP, indeed, climate change is the topic that connects all of us. And of course, the climate consequences are not distributed equally. Africa is much more vulnerable when it comes to climate change. And we can see the reality on the ground in many countries already, which is why the industrialized states also have a lot of responsibility when it comes to supporting resilience and adjustment. And loss and damage was on the agenda of the COP for the first time. And the feeling was that this was an important step towards more climate justice. Of course, we also said, or the EU Commission also said, that more can and more must be done. We also have the Team Europe initiative for climate adjustment and resilience with over 100 million euro, and 60 million euro goes towards compensating loss and damages. So this is a common Team Europe initiative by Denmark, Germany, France, and the Netherlands with different focus areas. It's about early detection systems. It's about financial security against climate catastrophe risks. But it's also, for example, about analyzing data. So many focus areas indeed.
After everything that we just heard. So basically, we just heard from the European Commission that also after last week's meeting, that it's very important that the African Union and the European Union meet on eye level. Is this something where you would say this is fact, or how do you perceive the meetings or the relationship? And then also, please allow me to also ask on the climate question. Do you feel like how does this go down on the African continent that there's now this new fund?
Thanks so much, Luisa, and also thanks to the other panelists for their interventions. I hope you can hear me well. Yeah. First of all, for me, let me just start with the perception of togetherness in crisis. This sort of seems to imply that when times are good, we don't need to be that together. So I think from the African side, this was something that was clearly, highlighted. The fact that now, when the crisis, especially the Ukraine crisis, then we see more move from the EU highlighting it. And maybe even just to point to the fact that food security has already been on the AU's calendar. This is the theme of this year. But at the summit in February, it didn't get as much attention. It's only after the fact, when now Ukraine happened, and then we see more attention going to food security. So if we were to say meeting on the same level, I think this needs to be really interrogated. And then to your point about climate change. There are various aspects to the climate change discussion, of course, closely linked to the issue of energy transition. And this has been a contentious issue in the partnership. The fact that, on the African side, the countries see their right to develop, which is the African Charter, actually, using the natural resources, but then you have push from the EU to phase out fossil fuels, but then not entirely within its own borders. So you have all these questions where, are we really meeting at the same level? It could be that everyone has an understanding of the problem, but not necessarily shared interests. So for me, I've seen a lot from the African stakeholders as to how they view this. People are calling for more honest dialogue. Let us be frank. We may agree on issues, but the pathways to get there differ, and that is okay. But to then sit back and have the African crisis not get as much attention as when the crisis is affecting the EU, people are now questioning the partnership. Are we really moving together? Are we together in all seasons? I leave it there for now.
Thank you very much for this insight. Frau Dr. Witt, Sie haben eine stärker politische...
Dr. Witt, you suggested a stronger political partnership. Now, a number of points have been mentioned. How would these points obtain consideration in such a political partnership? Well, we need a political partnership where, for example, for the summits, both sides equally contribute towards the agenda points And we saw this in past bigger summits, that topics which were a priority for the African side didn't make it to the top of the agenda. So that would be one important point, that the agenda items are dictated by both sides equally, and that we prioritize topics which, from a European perspective, perhaps aren't at the core. That would indeed lead to more equality. Now, secondly, what we currently see and what we also observed in the light of the latest developments over the last weeks is this politics of numbers, which always determined the relationship. That in the framework of summits, there were also always big announcements of new commitments, new numbers for different areas. And this is something that is repeating itself now. So we do not observe a change in approach here. In my opinion, this could be tackled differently. That the public communication of this partnership doesn't always consist of the EU communicating what sums are being dispersed. And to be honest, in the past, they became more and more unrealistic, and they also led to great frustration, to be honest. So we need to change our approach here too. Perhaps we need to concretely determine what topics one is deciding to focus on. More focus should be paid to the contents, and that could also be recognizing divergences, for example. I think it's very important to create the room for this. And perhaps one thing to put a framework on this. We spoke about the global gateway. Now, this new European engagement is the result of a geopolitical situation, because Europe is now competing with China, with Russia in its relationship with Africa, but it's also competing with other players, including Turkey or Qatar or the Emirates, depending, of course, on what region we're speaking about. And against this background, it is very important to think about this relationship and to think about what quality this relationship have also in comparison to the others. I don't think we'll be able to compete at the level of figures with regards to investments with China. I think what matters is to show that we want to promote a high-quality partnership. That will be the way to differentiate ourselves, because the belief that we'll enter a future where the African sides have to decide for one side is unrealistic. Politically speaking, it is also wrong, in my opinion, and that is why it must become clearer what kind of partnership this is to be and what advantages would result on both sides from such a partnership. You spoke about the global gateway strategy. It is considered a counterweight to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Do you agree with this? That with the global gateway strategy, one is creating a counterweight to China. It is definitely one tool. It was just said that we shouldn't speak about figures, about numbers all that much, but one number is interesting in my opinion. Africa's share of Chinese foreign trade is 3%, so we're a lot better there. Often we're impressed by the Chinese presence. And of course we find ourselves in a situation where a lot of African governments wanting to get the best from both worlds. And it is not up to us to tell African states who to engage with. All African countries are going to have their experiences with partners, be it the US, Europe, or the Chinese. I'll leave out the others for now. And I am still very much convinced that with our offers for Africa, in the long term, we are the best partner. Because we are democracies on the one hand, but also because we show how via partnerships within Europe you can be successful in obtaining peace and prosperity for decades, and of course economic development. And that is why I'm not very pessimistic in this regard. What is lacking in Africa, unfortunately, is that the institutions that were set up aren't necessarily strong as institutions. The African Union, as powerful as it might look like from the outside, if you look at the buildings, well, the African Union is hardly obtaining any competencies from its member states, which it could then use as a tool in its negotiations with us. And the regions that are organizing itself, the East African Community, for example, or SADC in the south. So here too, at a regional level, these aren't real tangible things, says the speaker, where we could commit for a longer period of time at an institutional level. We have a more of an ad hoc approach when there are crises, but institutionally speaking, the African Union is still fairly weak. So unfortunately, that isn't what we can build up our long-term relationship on, at least not hitherto. Now, based on the African agenda for the free trade zone, where as a continent they really committed themselves amongst each other, I would wish for us offering concrete help for this to really happen. That would also be in our interest.
A chance to react to the statements, and I would just do this without asking you a question.
Thank you so much, Lucia. I would like to react to some of the points you made, Michael. Firstly, on the African Union, yes, you do mention some of the institutional weaknesses, but we have to also be fair that the African Union has been going through an institutional reform process, trying to strengthen itself. And there are areas where not necessarily comparable to EU's competence, but strength. Peace and security is one of them. Let's be honest. The African Union, with its African peace security architecture, has at least put this on the map. You know, it's been able to get funding for peace support operations. It has a roadmap, you know, with clear silence in the guns. So this is an area where we see added value of the African Union. But then, in fact, the EU may be challenging this. Let's speak about the European Peace Facility. Apart from, of course, the concerns about sustainability, given the fact that most of the funds have so far been pledged to Ukraine, I've also heard from the ambassador saying something like, sometimes to access funding, it comes with conditionalities. Yet we see Ukraine's increase pledges without the same conditionalities. Two, the fact that the European Peace Facility allows the EU to give lethal weapons to member states, sometimes even bypassing the AU's institutional setup. This is not only problematic for proliferation of weapons, but also undermining what the AU has built. So I think we should be honest about strengths and weaknesses of the African Union. Two, during COVID-19, it was the AU together with the Africa CDC mobilizing. I like the fact that sitting in Maastricht, I could go on the Africa CDC website and check all the new cases throughout all 54 countries. Not even Europe was that organized, let's be honest. So I think we should be fair in judging the institution. Of course, it has its weaknesses, but the key point should be that any support should be tailored to what the African Union and its member states are already doing. You mentioned the AFCFTA. This is a good inroad. And I think if support is given to what's already being planned in terms of value chains, this is a critical issue in Africa. People have been singing the song about infrastructure. Who stepped up to the plate? It has been China. So I think we need to have these honest conversations about what the African priorities are, and can the EU be that partner for Africa?
I have a comment here which I think somehow fits. Es kommt von Herrn Bezikow.
From Mr. Bezikow. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what he does, but he says a large part of the African states do not have democratic governments. And this brings us to the topic of conditionality. That is very important for successful economic and social development. And if the EU focuses on democratic structures, there's the risk that many African states would rather work together with Russia and China, which of course could be a dilemma. Now, I assume this is currently still being interpreted, says the speaker. I'm going to ask you, because you probably have the best insight. What is your view of this observation, of this comment?
Share this assessment, or do you think that this plays a role?
I hope I got the question right. It was about the governance in Africa and the fact that Africa could be looking to other partners.
It's basically if the European Union is being too demanding when it comes to democratic or rule of law procedures, that then they should not wonder when some African states might want to go and line up with Russia and China.
Okay. Of course, it's a sovereign state's decision who its partners are, but I think we should be quite clear that the African Union itself also does support the rule of law governance. It has a whole charter on democracy, elections, governance that seeks to enforce the same rules that the EU, for example, with its conditionalities is doing. So we shouldn't assume that African countries are all for coup d'etats and unconstitutional government and all that. But the point is, if the conditionalities make people prefer other partners because of ease of doing business, then we have seen examples of that, for example, with China and some countries also involved with Russia for military. But I think we should be honest and see that ultimately these principles need to be applied. It may not be through the EU, but I think African countries themselves should also ensure that these rules are applied.
Also ich finde schon, wir sollten durchaus das Prinzip more for more anwenden. Das heißt, wenn
More for more is a principle. If one country is democratic, has good rule of law, and is developing positively, then these states should also be supported. And they should see that this makes a difference. I'm not speaking about humanitarian aid and emergency situations. This should always be offered, regardless of the governance. When there is a catastrophe, we should help. But there should be a difference as to whether a country had democratic elections or not, for example. Let's think about Tunisia, for example. Here we're simply carrying on as the European Union as in the past. And it doesn't make a difference whether we are going to have a democratic election or not. Even the African court had a verdict in September with regards to what this president is doing there. Also from the Venice Commission, there have been comments about the rule of law there, but we're simply carrying on along the same line. So I'm also critical towards the European Union here, that there's no changes absolutely, depending on whether they are democratic processes here or not. Either we only think about our interests, and then we don't have to have a debate about good governance and human rights, or we are serious and also change our politics for better or for worse. More for more must also result in less for less. In a country like Ghana, for example, which stood on our side with regards to Ukraine, should perhaps also be regarded more positively in other opportunities. Now, there was some criticism vis-à-vis the European Commission with regards to Tunisia on the one hand, but there's also been criticism with regards to the Ukraine, with regards to lacking conditionalities. What is your opinion on this? I would like to react to a number of things that have been said until now. Firstly, with regards to the perception of what topics are high up on the agenda and which ones aren't. The Africa-EU partnership isn't entirely novel. The first joint Africa-EU strategy was already created in 2007, and topics like sustainable agriculture or food security, food production, new technologies, these are all topics that have been on the agenda on a permanent basis already. And here, the Commission is investing and doing a whole lot. During the meeting on Monday between the two commissions, it was also made clear that for the African Union, this is a very important topic. We also have the year for food security in 2022, and a task force was created with regards to bottlenecks for fertilizers. What are the challenges here and what can concretely be done? So new task forces and dialogues are created to ensure that discussions are upheld and to also adjust this to the current situation. The same thing is the case when it comes to value chains. On Monday, the high-level policy dialogue for economic integration was created, which is to serve as a platform to allow for the two commissions, the African Union and the European Union, to have an exchange with regards to this topic, and especially to respond to the question what concretely is being required. The first dialogue is to start next year. Then, further topic, which was mentioned in the presentation, is the joint learning and capacity building and the exchange of knowledge, because the African Union and the European Union work together on a whole lot of different levels. On Monday, for example, it was also discussed how one can work together at an administrative level, for example, when it comes to an exchange of staff, also to ensure that this community learning can take place. So a whole lot is happening at the moment. And a lot of things that are happening are building up on things that have been up and running for a number of years now, because the partnership is developing, but it is also permanent and has also a good basis that was created in the past. Of course, there are areas that need improvement, and the European Commission is very much open for this and is constantly in dialogue with African partners at different levels. There was now the meeting of the two commissions, which takes place at a yearly base. Then every 3 years, there's the summit of the heads of states. Then every year, there's a dialogue of the ministers for foreign affairs. And at the moment, discussions are also being held about how the summit commitments can be monitored and how it can be determined whether these commitments also really happened. So a whole lot of things that are currently in progress. Thank you very much. I have a question from the audience, which is pretty fitting. The question is,
partnerships on communal level. Do you think that the approach of twinning municipalities should be supported by programs to bring the abstract term of African-European partnership down to earth? Ich stelle die mal offen I'm asking this like openly, whoever wants to intervene is free to do so. Okay. I think I saw. Do you think this would be a good approach to kind of go forward?
Before I go on the approach, I would like to just follow up on what Luisa said. For me, within this partnership, you have mentioned the different institutions, but I think what still is a challenge is the follow-up. If I'm to ask you, frankly, to give us a follow-up of Abidjan, would you be able to? So to a lot of people, they see the summit, but they don't see the follow-up to the commitments. So going back to your question about whether we think twinning would work, I think, first of all, there has to be an institutionalism of civil society, private sector, the youth, and local authorities within the partnership, because the top-down approach doesn't seem to be working. People see summits, they don't see follow-up to commitments. So possibly, if we start from the bottom-up approach, with the local authorities involved, people understand the dynamics of the areas, it may be that we see a difference in the partnership. Twinning could work, and I think there are some in place with the Freetown and I think Italy, if I'm not mistaken. So they seem to be already progress to that sort of partnership.
Also man sieht es hier bei den Ortsschildern in Brüssel.
In Brussels, I think if there is a personal relationship, for example, as can be seen here with Congo, and you have people that are engaged concretely, that always is helpful. We're also trying to do this with Ukraine. My city in Hessen has a partnership with Santa Catarina and the Cap Verde. And there has been an exchange of staff between businesses here. So at that level, we have already seen concrete effects, for example, in my city too. But logistically speaking, this is hard to upkeep if there aren't concrete people who actually do this at a communal level. And for those countries that had colonies and where things continued to exist, it would be easier than for a country like Germany, where perhaps you'd have to start from scratch. And then, like I said, this is often only done by individual persons. But the communal level should be considered in our development cooperation in the different countries. Especially if certain governments don't work well in individual countries, that doesn't mean that municipalities are dysfunctional. We have a lot of engaged mayors and people on the ground. And here we should work together with our organizations at a local level, also church communities or Caritas. All of those actors need to be involved. We should see at a local level what can be done directly on the ground without having to go via a perhaps corrupt government. That way you can ensure that it actually reaches the people, because that can then be ensured via the individual partners. Thank you very much. This also goes down the political direction. Would you like to say something about this? I'd like to seize the opportunity to get back to the question of conditionality and the values. We just discussed this. Should the future EU strategy reduce its focus on values, or should the values be used for good conditionalities? If we reduce the focus on values, this will lead to a credibility problem, but focusing on the values and focusing only on the formal straight structures would be wrong, in my opinion. Especially in the Sahel region, we're currently seeing that countries such as Mali, which were considered the pioneers in democracy, well, we see what happened with them. Also in other countries, we can see that there are issues with regards to political legitimacy of governments. So when it comes to assessing the governance structures, it would be wrong, in my opinion, to only focus on formal processes. And that is why these relationships beyond governments are extremely important in order to assess where progressive political forces can be found that can be used for a partnership beyond the government, potentially speaking. And this is of central importance, that countries aren't scraped off the list of potential cooperation partners solely because the government doesn't fulfill certain formal standards. In my opinion, that is very important. Now, Mrs. Ossmann, you're very much focusing on the youth. Are there any approaches here that would fit well into this bottom-up structure? Indeed. I'd like to thank you for your feedback, first and foremost, because in communication, in the follow-up, there clearly is room for improvement. Also with regards to externally communicating what actually exactly is happening between the summits and how this is expressing itself concretely. And now with regards to youth and local organizations, that is a very important topic for us. Last month, we have presented the so-called Youth Action Plan. That is the first EU strategy to get young people involved in the external actions of the EU with the 3 pillars: engage, empower, and connect. And that has a number of flagship projects such as the Youth Empowerment Fund, which in the future will serve to fund concrete projects that really are led by young people. So a lot is happening on this level, but also when it comes to governance. In the EU partnership, there's the EU Youth Hub, which will enter the next round next year, where young experts are being asked to offer advice for the development of this partnership. We also have the so-called Youth Sounding Board, which is also closely connected to the delegations in the different countries, where at a local level, young people could apply as consultants and experts for the delegations at a local level to ensure that there is a direct link to the local realities. So that is a very important topic. And these organizations are increasingly supported directly with the help of these new programs. Thank you very much. A small technical question that was posed by the audience, directed at the EU Commission. What EU means foreseen for financing, for helping fund the African Union? Now, the EU, up to 50% of the African Union, which of course is a big share. And we're talking about a number of different aspects. There's administrative support, and the motto always is African solutions for African problems. We, for example, have the African government's architecture. This is very much being supported by the EU Commission and for a long time now, and it will continue to be supported. We're nearing the end of our discussion.
To Ms. Apiko, because I really wonder about this. So there was this meeting last week, and beforehand, Mr. Borrell, High Representative, answered a question of a journalist, and then he said that not a single euro allocated to Africa will go to Ukraine. I don't know if you heard about it, but it raised the question in me, is this a worry on the continent? Is this being discussed, or what would be your perception?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. Yes, I had heard this, and I've had it also in several panels where the EU has reiterated that the money for Africa will not be, part of what is being pledged to Ukraine. But I think from the African side, it's more about understanding where this money is going to come from in the first place. A lot of people still grapple with where the 150 billion is going to come from and how even to access it. So it's all good that 600 million has been pledged till 2024, if I'm not mistaken. But we see other crises arising. So is this fund already secured? What happens if the needs are above 600? So I think it's a legitimate questions to be asked. But I will also say from the African side, they should for themselves to try to be self-sustaining with the funding. They do have a peace fund that is yet to be endowed. They have a 0.2% levy that not all member states are implementing. So I think in also questioning where the support from the EU is coming, self-reflection is necessary on the EU side to say, how can we for ourselves be able to finance some of these peace support operations? But not only that, also mediation, conflict prevention, and most importantly, post-conflict reconstruction development to avoid the cycle.
Thank you very much. Sie sehen, ich glaube, wir könnten jetzt hier...
As you can see, we could easily discuss this topic for another hour, but we won't do that because it is now 2 p.m. So I'd like to wish all of you a nice day. Thank you very much for joining us here in the representation or in front of your laptops at home. Thank you very much.